The lecture hall felt different when Samuel Morris saved him a seat. Ralph Gomez noticed it first on a Tuesday morning in October, the way Samuel's backpack claimed the empty chair beside him like a quiet declaration. When Ralph approached, Samuel would look up with that familiar smile, but something had shifted in his eyes, something that made Ralph's chest tighten with a hope he didn't dare name. Samuel said, "Hey, saved you a spot," his voice carrying that same easy warmth it always had. But when Ralph settled into the chair, when their shoulders brushed as Ralph pulled out his notebook, Samuel would go quiet, not the comfortable silence of two friends who had known each other since freshman orientation, but something charged and careful, something that made Ralph hyper-aware of every breath, every accidental touch, every stolen glance. Ralph had been in love with his best friend for 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days. Not that he was counting, not that he lay awake at night replaying every conversation, every laugh, every moment when Samuel's hand had lingered on his shoulder just a fraction too long. Ralph had become an expert at reading the signs that meant nothing, at finding hope in gestures that were probably just friendship, at torturing himself with possibilities that felt both inevitable and impossible. But this was different. This careful attention, this deliberate seat saving, this new quiet that settled between them like a question neither of them knew how to ask. Ralph found himself analyzing every interaction, cataloging the small changes in Samuel's behavior like evidence in a case he was afraid to build. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The pattern had started 3 weeks earlier, after Ralph had spent an entire evening listening to Samuel complain about his latest girlfriend, Michelle Scott. They had been sitting in Ralph's dorm room, Samuel sprawled across the bed, while Ralph tried to focus on his psychology homework, and Samuel had been going on and on about how Michelle was sweet and pretty and everything he should want, but something was missing, something he couldn't name. Ralph remembered the way his heart had twisted as he offered the same supportive advice he always gave, the same careful words that never betrayed how much it hurt to help the person he loved figure out their relationships with other people. He had become an expert at being the perfect best friend, at swallowing his own feelings to make room for Samuel's needs, at pretending his heart didn't break a little more each time Samuel kissed someone else. But that night, something in Samuel's voice had been different, a frustration that went deeper than simple relationship troubles, a restlessness that seemed to encompass more than just his feelings about Michelle. Samuel had stared at the ceiling and said, "I don't know what's wrong with me, Ralph. I have everything I'm supposed to want, but I feel like I'm just going through the motions, like I'm playing a part in someone else's life." Ralph had wanted to say so much in that moment, had wanted to tell Samuel that maybe he was looking for the wrong things, that maybe what he was missing wasn't something Michelle could give him. But Ralph had learned long ago that hope was a dangerous thing, that reading too much into Samuel's words would only lead to more heartbreak. So he had made some non-committal sound and suggested that maybe Samuel just needed to give the relationship more time. The next morning was when the seat saving had started. Now, sitting in their American literature class, Ralph found himself stealing glances at Samuel's profile as Professor Virginia Hall droned on about transcendentalism. Samuel's jaw was tense, his usual relaxed posture replaced by something more guarded. When Ralph shifted in his seat, Samuel's eyes flicked toward him for just a moment before darting away, and Ralph caught something in that brief look that made his pulse quicken. After class, as they walked across campus toward the dining hall, Samuel was quieter than usual. His hands were shoved deep in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the path ahead, and Ralph found himself struggling to fill the silence with normal conversation. The easy rhythm they had always shared felt disrupted, replaced by something that hummed with unspoken tension. They had been friends since their first week of college, when Ralph had found Samuel sitting alone in the common room of their dorm, looking lost and homesick. Ralph had been struggling with his own adjustment to college life, the overwhelming freedom and responsibility, the constant noise and activity that never seemed to stop. But something about Samuel's quiet sadness had drawn him in, had made him want to offer comfort even when he barely knew how to comfort himself. Their friendship had developed naturally, built on late-night conversations about everything and nothing, study sessions that turned into philosophical discussions, shared meals and inside jokes, and the kind of easy companionship that felt effortless. Samuel was the kind of person who made everyone around him feel seen and valued, who remembered details about people's lives and asked follow-up questions and genuinely cared about the answers. Ralph had fallen in love gradually, then all at once. It had started with admiration for Samuel's kindness, his intelligence, his ability to make Ralph laugh even on the worst days. But somewhere along the way, admiration had shifted into something deeper, more consuming. Ralph had found himself noticing the way Samuel's eyes crinkled when he smiled, the way his voice got softer when he was tired, the way he unconsciously leaned closer during conversations. The realization that he was in love with his best friend had been both a revelation and a disaster. It had changed everything and nothing, had made every interaction feel loaded with meaning, while simultaneously making Ralph hyper-aware of all the ways he needed to hide his feelings. He had become an expert at casual touches that meant everything to him and nothing to Samuel, at listening to relationship advice requests without letting his face betray how much they hurt, at being the perfect supportive friend while slowly dying inside. But lately, something had been different. Samuel's complaints about Michelle had taken on a different quality, less focused on specific relationship issues and more about a general sense of disconnection. He had started asking strange questions, hypothetical scenarios that felt too specific to be entirely theoretical. Questions like, do you think it's possible to love someone and still feel like something fundamental is missing? Or, have you ever felt like you were attracted to the idea of someone rather than the actual person? Ralph had answered these questions carefully, trying to be helpful while not revealing too much about his own experiences. But each conversation had left him feeling more unsettled, more aware of the undercurrents running beneath their friendship. Samuel's behavior had become increasingly erratic. Moments of intense focus followed by periods of distraction, conversations that started normally but veered into territory that felt dangerously personal. The seat saving was just the latest manifestation of whatever was happening between them. Samuel would arrive early to their shared classes, would place his backpack on the chair beside him with an intentionality that felt deliberate. When Ralph approached, Samuel's face would light up with genuine pleasure, but underneath that happiness was something else, something that looked almost like nervousness. Ralph found himself arriving earlier and earlier to classes, not wanting to risk the possibility that Samuel might save a seat for someone else. The thought of watching Samuel's face fall when another classmate claimed the spot felt unbearable, even though Ralph wasn't entirely sure why Samuel was saving it for him in the first place. Their usual routine had been to find seats wherever they were available, sitting together when possible but not making a big deal about it. This new pattern felt like a promise neither of them had made, a claim that neither of them had voiced. Ralph would slide into the saved seat, and Samuel would smile and say something casual about the reading assignment or the weather. But underneath the normal conversation was a current of something else, something that made Ralph's skin feel too tight, made him hyper-aware of every point where their bodies almost touched. During their biology lab later that week, Ralph noticed Samuel watching him with an intensity that felt new. They were supposed to be examining plant cells under microscopes, but every time Ralph looked up, Samuel's gaze was on him instead of the slide. When their eyes met, Samuel would quickly look away, a flush creeping up his neck that made Ralph's heart race. The lab required them to work in close proximity, sharing equipment and comparing observations, and Ralph found himself acutely aware of every brush of Samuel's fingers against his own. Samuel seemed equally affected, his usual steady hands fumbling with the microscope adjustments, his breathing slightly uneven when Ralph leaned closer to point out a particular cellular structure. Their lab partner, Joan James, seemed oblivious to the tension crackling between them, chattering away about her weekend plans while Ralph and Samuel navigated the charged space of almost touching, of meaningful glances, of conversations that felt like they were about something entirely different than plant biology. When Samuel's hand accidentally covered Ralph's while reaching for a slide, they both froze. The contact lasted only a moment, but Ralph felt the impact of it like an electric shock, traveling up his arm and settling somewhere in the region of his heart. Samuel's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, Ralph thought he saw something there that mirrored his own feelings. But then Samuel pulled his hand away and turned his attention back to the microscope, leaving Ralph to wonder if he had imagined the whole thing. That evening, Ralph found himself replaying the moment obsessively, analyzing every detail for hidden meaning. Samuel's expression when their hands had touched, the way his breath had caught, the fraction of a second where he had seemed to lean closer before pulling away. Ralph had become an expert at reading too much into innocent interactions, but this had felt different, less innocent, more intentional. He was still thinking about it when Samuel knocked on his door later that night, appearing in the hallway with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that Ralph couldn't quite decipher. Samuel said, "Thought you might want some caffeine for studying," but his voice carried an undertone that suggested this wasn't really about coffee or studying. Ralph let him in, and Samuel settled onto the bed like he always did, but tonight there was something different about his posture. Less relaxed, more alert. He handed Ralph one of the cups, and their fingers brushed again, and this time Ralph was certain he didn't imagine the way Samuel's touch lingered. They tried to study, spreading their books and notes across the bed between them, but the material felt secondary to whatever was happening in the spaces between words. Samuel kept stealing glances at Ralph when he thought Ralph wasn't looking, and Ralph found himself doing the same thing. The air in the room felt charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm when everything becomes hyper-aware and electric. Samuel was the first to abandon the pretense of studying, closing his textbook with a decisive thud and turning to face Ralph directly. He said, "Can I ask you something?" And Ralph's heart immediately started racing because Samuel's voice had taken on that careful quality that usually preceded conversations about feelings. Ralph nodded, not trusting his voice, and Samuel was quiet for a long moment, seeming to gather his thoughts. Finally, he said, "Do you think it's possible to be attracted to someone and not realize it for a long time? Like, to mistake it for something else?" The question hit Ralph like a physical blow, simultaneously too close to his own experience and too vague to be safely answered. He managed to say, "What do you mean?" though his voice sounded strange to his own ears. Samuel ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Ralph recognized as a sign of frustration or nervousness. He said, "I've been thinking about some things lately, about relationships and attraction and what it means to really connect with someone. And I keep coming back to this feeling that I've been missing something important, something that's been right in front of me by." Ralph's mouth went dry. He wanted to ask for clarification, wanted to push for specifics, but he was terrified of where the conversation might lead. Instead, he said, "That's pretty normal, I think. Sometimes we don't see things clearly until we're ready to see them." Samuel nodded, but his expression suggested Ralph's answer hadn't satisfied him. He said, "What about you? Have you ever felt like you were attracted to someone but couldn't admit it to yourself?" The question was so direct, so pointed, that Ralph felt like Samuel could see straight through him. He struggled to find an answer that was honest without being revealing, finally settling on, "I think most people have complicated feelings about attraction. It's not always as straightforward as we pretend it is." Samuel leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Ralph's face. He said, "I keep thinking about this thing my sister said to me last month. She told me that sometimes the people we're closest to are the ones we're most blind about, that we can spend so much time categorizing a relationship as one thing that we never considered it might be something else entirely." Ralph felt like the room was tilting around him. Samuel's words were too specific, too loaded with meaning to be casual conversation. But Ralph had been wrong before about reading signals, had convinced himself that meaningful looks in loaded conversations were signs of mutual attraction when they were probably just products of his own wishful thinking. He said, "Your sister sounds wise," which was safe and noncommittal, but felt inadequate given the weight of what Samuel seemed to be trying to say. Samuel was quiet for a moment, studying Ralph's face with an intensity that made Ralph want to look away. Then he said, "Ralph, I need to tell you something, but I'm afraid it might change things between us." Ralph's heart was beating so hard he was certain Samuel could hear it. He said, "You can tell me anything," though he wasn't sure that was entirely true. There were some things that, once said, couldn't be unsaid. Some conversations that changed everything regardless of how they ended. Samuel took a deep breath, and Ralph could see him gathering his courage. He said, "I think I've been lying to myself about what I want, about who I am, and I think it has to do with you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and possibility. Ralph felt like he couldn't breathe, like the entire world had narrowed down to this moment, this conversation, this admission that felt too good to be true. He said, "What are you saying?" though his voice was barely above a whisper. Samuel's eyes were bright with something that looked like fear and hope and determination all mixed together. He said, "I'm saying that maybe the reason I can't connect with Michelle or with any of the girls I've dated is because I'm not supposed to be with girls at all. I'm saying that maybe the person I've been looking for has been sitting right next to me this whole time." Ralph felt like the world had stopped spinning. Samuel's words echoed in his head, too important and too impossible to fully process. He stared at Samuel's face, searching for any sign that this was some kind of joke or misunderstanding, but Samuel's expression was completely serious. Ralph said, "Samuel," and then stopped because he didn't know what came next. How do you respond when the person you've been in love with for over 2 years suddenly suggests they might feel the same way? How do you trust that this is real and not just another moment that you'll later realize you misinterpreted? Samuel seemed to understand Ralph's hesitation. He said, "I know this is a lot. I know it's complicated and confusing and probably not what you expected to hear tonight. But I've been thinking about it for weeks, and I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is just friendship." Ralph's chest felt tight with emotion. He said, "How long have you known?" Because he needed to understand the timeline, needed to know if this was a recent realization or something Samuel had been hiding. Samuel said, "I think part of me has always known, but I've been really good at not letting myself think about it. But lately, especially since that night we talked about Michelle, I can't stop thinking about you, about us, about what it would be like if we were more than friends." Ralph felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by relief and joy and terror all at once. He said, "I've been in love with you for over 2 years," and the admission felt like jumping off a cliff, terrifying and liberating at the same time. Samuel's face transformed, surprise and happiness, and something that looked like wonder all washing over his features. He said, 2 years, and Ralph nodded, suddenly embarrassed by how long he had been harboring these feelings without saying anything. Samuel said, "God, Ralph, all this time I've been complaining to you about my relationships, asking you for advice about other people, and you never said anything." Ralph said, "What was I supposed to say? You seemed happy with Michelle, or at least trying to be happy. I didn't want to complicate things or ruin our friendship." Samuel reached out tentatively, his fingers brushing against Ralph's hand. He said, "You wouldn't have ruined anything. If anything, you might have saved me from wasting so much time trying to force feelings that were never going to develop." The touch of Samuel's fingers against his skin sent electricity shooting up Ralph's arm. He turned his hand over, palm up, and Samuel's fingers traced patterns across his skin that made Ralph's breath catch. Samuel said, "I broke up with Michelle yesterday." Ralph's eyes widened. He said, "You did?" Samuel nodded. He said, "I couldn't keep pretending. It wasn't fair to her, and it wasn't fair to me. And it definitely wasn't fair to you, even if you didn't know it at the time." Ralph felt like he was dreaming. This conversation, this admission, this gentle touch that was making his entire body hum with awareness, it all felt too good to be real. He said, "I can't believe this is happening." Samuel's thumb traced across Ralph's knuckles, and the sensation made Ralph's eyes flutter closed for a moment. When he opened them, Samuel was watching him with an expression of such tenderness that Ralph felt his heart might burst. Samuel said, "Can I ask you something?" Ralph nodded, not trusting his voice. Samuel said, "What would you say if I told you I've been thinking about kissing you?" Ralph's breath caught. He said, "I'd say I've been thinking about that too, for a very long time." Samuel's eyes dropped to Ralph's lips, and Ralph felt the air between them become charged with possibility. Samuel said, "I'm scared," and Ralph understood exactly what he meant. This moment felt like standing on the edge of something enormous, something that would change everything between them. Ralph said, "Me too, but scared in a good way." Samuel smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing Ralph had ever seen. He said, "Yeah, scared in a good way." They were sitting close enough that Ralph could feel the warmth radiating from Samuel's body, could count the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Samuel's hand was still tracing patterns on Ralph's skin, sending shivers of sensation up his arm and down his spine. Samuel said, I don't want to rush this. I don't want to mess it up. Ralph said, we don't have to rush anything. We can take this as slow as you need. But even as he said it, Ralph was acutely aware of how much he wanted to close the distance between them, to find out if Samuel's lips were as soft as they looked, to discover what it would feel like to kiss the person he had been dreaming about for over 2 years. Samuel seemed to be having similar thoughts. His gaze kept dropping to Ralph's mouth, and Ralph could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. Want warring with caution, desire fighting against the fear of changing something precious and irreplaceable. Ralph made the decision for both of them. He leaned forward slowly, giving Samuel plenty of time to pull away if he wanted to, and brushed his lips against Samuel's in the softest, most tentative of kisses. Samuel's breath hitched, and for a moment he went very still. Then he was kissing Ralph back, his lips moving against Ralph's with a sweetness that made Ralph's entire world tilt on its axis. The kiss was gentle and questioning, and full of 2 years' worth of suppressed longing, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. Samuel rested his forehead against Ralph's, his eyes still closed. He said, wow. Ralph said, yeah. Wow. They stayed like that for a moment, foreheads touching, sharing the same air, and Ralph felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be for the first time in his entire life. Samuel opened his eyes and smiled, and Ralph saw his own wonder and happiness reflected back at him. Samuel said, that was even better than I imagined. Ralph said, you imagined it. Samuel laughed softly. He said, Ralph, I've been imagining it for weeks, ever since I started admitting to myself how I really felt about you. Ralph felt a surge of joy so intense it was almost overwhelming. He said, I love you. I've loved you for so long. Samuel's expression grew serious, tender. He said, I love you too. I think I always have. I just didn't know how to recognize it for what it was. They kissed again, longer this time, deeper, and Ralph felt like he was discovering a new language, learning how to communicate everything he had been feeling through the press of lips and the gentle exploration of tongues. Samuel's hands came up to cup Ralph's face, thumbs brushing across his cheekbones, and Ralph melted into the touch. When they broke apart again, Samuel said, I should probably go talk to Michelle. Officially end things and explain what's happening. Ralph nodded, though part of him wanted to keep Samuel here in this bubble of new love and possibility forever. He said, that's the right thing to do. Samuel said, will you wait for me? I mean, will you be here when I get back? Ralph smiled. He said, I've been waiting for you for 2 years. I'm not going anywhere now. Samuel kissed him once more, quick and sweet, and then gathered his things. At the door, he turned back and said, this is real, right? This is actually happening. Ralph said, it's real. We're real. Samuel's smile could have powered the entire campus. He said, I'll be back soon. After Samuel left, Ralph sat on his bed in a daze, touching his lips and trying to process everything that had just happened. The boy he had been in love with for over 2 years had just confessed his own feelings, had kissed him, had said he loved him too. It felt too good to be true, like something out of a dream or a movie rather than his actual life. But the lingering taste of Samuel's kiss on his lips was real, and the memory of Samuel's hands cupping his face was real, and the way Samuel had looked at him with such tenderness and wonder was definitely real. Ralph felt like he was glowing from the inside out, like happiness was radiating from every pore. He tried to study while he waited for Samuel to return, but concentration was impossible. His mind kept replaying every moment of their conversation, every touch, every look, every word. The way Samuel's voice had gotten soft when he said he loved him, the way his eyes had fluttered closed during their first kiss, the way he had smiled like Ralph was the most wonderful thing he had ever seen. About an hour later, Samuel knocked on the door again, and Ralph practically flew across the room to let him in. Samuel looked relieved but slightly drained, and Ralph immediately pulled him into a hug. Samuel melted into the embrace, burying his face in Ralph's shoulder. He said, that was harder than I expected. Ralph rubbed soothing circles on Samuel's back. He said, how did she take it? Samuel pulled back slightly so he could look at Ralph's face. He said, she was hurt, obviously, but I think she also wasn't completely surprised. She said she had been feeling like I was holding back, like I wasn't fully present in the relationship. She deserved better than that. Ralph nodded. He said, I'm sorry it was difficult. Samuel said, I'm not. It needed to happen. And now it's done, and I can be completely honest about what I want, about who I want. He cupped Ralph's face in his hands again, and Ralph leaned into the touch. Samuel said, I want you, Ralph. I want to figure this out together, whatever this is between us. Ralph said, I want that too, more than anything. They spent the rest of the evening talking, really talking, about everything they had been feeling and thinking and hoping for. Samuel told Ralph about the moment he had first started questioning his sexuality, about the growing dissatisfaction with his relationships with women, about the way he had started noticing things about Ralph that felt different from how he noticed other friends. Ralph shared his own journey, the gradual realization that his feelings for Samuel went far beyond friendship, the careful way he had learned to hide his emotions, the pain of listening to Samuel talk about other relationships while desperately wishing he could be honest about his own feelings. They talked about their fears, about the challenges of navigating a relationship that would change the fundamental dynamic of their friendship, about what it would mean to come out to their families and friends. But underneath all the practical concerns was a current of joy and excitement, the thrill of finally being able to be honest with each other and with themselves. Samuel said, I keep thinking about all the time we've wasted, all the moments when I could have been kissing you instead of pretending I didn't want to. Ralph said, we weren't wasting time. We were building something. All those conversations, all that trust and friendship, that's the foundation for this. We're not starting from scratch. We're building on something that was already beautiful. Samuel smiled and kissed him again, and Ralph thought he could spend the rest of his life just kissing Samuel Morris and never get tired of it. Every kiss felt like a revelation, like discovering a new favorite song or tasting something delicious for the first time. They fell asleep curled up together in Ralph's narrow dorm bed, and Ralph woke up the next morning with Samuel's arm around his waist and sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment he lay still, hardly daring to breathe, afraid that moving might break the spell and reveal that this had all been an elaborate dream. But Samuel stirred beside him, pressing a sleepy kiss to the back of Ralph's neck, and Ralph knew that this was real. This beautiful, impossible thing was actually happening. Over the next few weeks, they navigated the delicate process of shifting from friends to something more. Some things changed dramatically. The way they could now hold hands while walking across campus, the way Samuel would kiss Ralph goodbye before classes, the way they could be physically affectionate without worrying about hiding their feelings. But other things remained beautifully the same. They still had their long conversations about everything and nothing, still studied together and laughed at inside jokes and then supported each other through the stress of college life. The foundation of their friendship remained solid, providing a stable base for their romantic relationship to grow from. Samuel continued to save Ralph a seat in all their shared classes, but now the gesture felt different, less like a question and more like a promise. When Ralph slid into the chair beside him, Samuel would smile and sometimes brush their hands together, a small acknowledgement of the new intimacy between them. Their classmates seemed to accept the change with minimal drama. A few people expressed surprise, but most seemed to think it made perfect sense. Joan James told Ralph that she had suspected something was developing between them for weeks, based on the way they looked at each other during biology lab. The more challenging conversations were with family. Samuel's parents were supportive but needed time to adjust their expectations and understanding of their son. Ralph's family was more immediately accepting, his mother saying that she just wanted him to be happy and that Samuel seemed like a wonderful young man. But the most important thing was how they felt together. Ralph had spent so long imagining what it would be like to be with Samuel that the reality was both exactly what he had hoped for and completely different from what he had expected. The emotional intimacy was everything he had dreamed of, but the physical chemistry was a revelation. Every touch, every kiss, every moment of closeness felt electric and right and perfect. Samuel threw himself into the relationship with the same intensity he brought to everything else in his life. He was affectionate and attentive and seemed determined to make up for lost time. He would show up at Ralph's door with coffee and pastries, would leave sweet notes in Ralph's textbooks, would text him throughout the day just to say he was thinking about him. Ralph sometimes felt overwhelmed by how much his life had changed, How the thing he had wanted most, but never dared to hope for, had actually happened. There were moments when he would catch Samuel looking at him with such love and wonder that Ralph felt like he might burst from happiness. One evening, about a month after their first kiss, they were lying in Samuel's bed talking about their plans for winter break when Samuel suddenly went quiet. Ralph looked over to find Samuel watching him with an expression of such tenderness that it took Ralph's breath away. Samuel said, "I need to tell you something." Ralph's heart skipped, but Samuel's tone was warm rather than worried. Ralph said, "What is it?" Samuel said, "I was so afraid that I had waited too long, that I had missed my chance with you. When I finally started admitting to myself how I felt, I was terrified that you had moved on, or that you would think I was just experimenting or confused." Ralph reached over and took Samuel's hand, intertwining their fingers. He said, "I would have waited forever for you. I was never going to move on." Samuel brought Ralph's hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to his knuckles. He said, "I don't know what I did to deserve you, but I'm grateful every single day that you're mine." Ralph said, "You didn't have to do anything to deserve me. You just had to be yourself. That's all you ever had to be." They kissed then, slow and sweet and full of promise, and Ralph thought about how much his life had changed since that first morning when Samuel had saved him a seat. How a simple gesture had been the beginning of everything he had ever wanted. Samuel said, "I love the way you taste like coffee in the morning." Ralph laughed. He said, "I love the way you hum when you're concentrating on homework." Samuel said, "I love how you always know exactly what to say when I'm stressed." Ralph said, "I love how you make me feel like the most important person in the world." They could have continued like that all night, cataloging all the small things they loved about each other, but instead they settled into comfortable silence, holding each other close and marveling at how perfectly they fit together. Ralph thought about the boy he had been just a few months ago, pining silently for his best friend and convinced that his feelings would never be returned. That version of himself seemed like a stranger now, someone who had been living only half a life, settling for scraps of attention and affection when he could have had everything. But he also felt grateful for that time of longing and uncertainty because it had taught him not to take this happiness for granted. Every kiss, every touch, every moment of being loved by Samuel felt precious and miraculous precisely because Ralph knew how easily it could have never happened at all. Samuel had fallen asleep against his shoulder, breathing deep and even, and Ralph lay awake for a while just watching him. The boy he loved looked peaceful and young in sleep, his face relaxed and free from the worry lines that sometimes appeared when he was stressed about school or family or the future. Ralph pressed a gentle kiss to the top of Samuel's head and whispered, "I love you," into the darkness. Samuel stirred slightly and mumbled something that sounded like "love you too" before settling back into deeper sleep. Ralph closed his eyes and let himself drift off, secure in the knowledge that he would wake up tomorrow, still loved, still wanted, still exactly where he belonged. The next few months passed in a blur of happiness and discovery. They learned each other's rhythms and preferences, figured out how to balance their relationship with their individual friendships and academic responsibilities, navigated the small conflicts and misunderstandings that were inevitable in any relationship. Ralph discovered that Samuel was surprisingly jealous, not in a possessive or controlling way, but in a way that revealed how much Ralph meant to him. When other students flirted with Ralph or showed interest in him, Samuel would get quiet and clingy, needing extra reassurance that Ralph only had eyes for him. Samuel learned that Ralph sometimes struggled with anxiety about whether he deserved to be loved, a lingering insecurity from years of believing his feelings were unrequited. During these moments, Samuel would be extra gentle and patient, reminding Ralph through words and actions that he was wanted and cherished. They had their first real fight about 3 months into their relationship, a stupid argument about study schedules that escalated into hurt feelings and raised voices. Ralph had stormed out of Samuel's room, convinced that this was it, that they had ruined everything, that he had been right to be afraid of risking their friendship. But Samuel had followed him, had knocked on Ralph's door an hour later, with tears in his eyes and apologies on his lips. They had talked it through, had figured out how to communicate better during disagreements, had learned that their love was strong enough to survive conflict. Ralph said, "I was so scared that we had broken something irreparable." Samuel said, Ralph, we're going to have fights. We're going to disagree and hurt each other's feelings sometimes. But that doesn't mean we're not meant to be together. It just means we're human. Ralph said, I don't know how to do this. I've never been in a relationship that mattered this much. Samuel cupped Ralph's face in his hands. He said, neither have I. We're figuring it out together, remember? That's what makes it an adventure. They made up with kisses and promises to be more patient with each other, and Ralph felt their bond grow stronger rather than weaker from having weathered their first storm. Spring semester brought new challenges and new joys. They moved in together, sharing a small apartment off campus that felt like their own private sanctuary. Ralph loved waking up next to Samuel every morning, loved coming home to find Samuel cooking dinner or studying at their kitchen table, loved the domestic intimacy of sharing space and building a life together. Samuel had become more confident in his identity as a gay man, more comfortable with public displays of affection, more willing to talk openly about their relationship with friends and family. Ralph watched him bloom into this new version of himself with pride and wonder, amazed at Samuel's courage and authenticity. They established new routines and traditions. Saturday morning coffee in bed while reading the news on their phones, Sunday evening study sessions at the kitchen table with takeout from their favorite Thai restaurant, Wednesday night movie marathons with popcorn and commentary that was usually more entertaining than whatever they were watching. Ralph's favorite tradition was the way Samuel would still save him a seat whenever they had classes together. Even though they arrived together and it was completely unnecessary, it had become a gesture of love rather than hope, a reminder of how their relationship had begun and how far they had come. One afternoon in April, they were sitting in their American literature class when Professor Virginia Hall announced that the final project would be a creative writing assignment. Students could choose to write a short story, a collection of poems, or a personal essay about a transformative experience in their lives. After class, as they walked home together, Samuel said, I know what I want to write about. Ralph said, what? Samuel said, us. This whole journey from friendship to love. The way you can know someone for years and then suddenly see them completely differently. Ralph felt his heart flutter. He said, you want to write about us? Samuel stopped walking and turned to face Ralph. He said, I want to write about how I fell in love with my best friend, about how the most important person in my life was right there all along, and I was too scared or too blind to see it, about how love doesn't always look the way you expect it to, but when it's real, it feels like coming home. Ralph felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He said, that sounds beautiful. Samuel said, will you help me with it? I want to get the details right, especially about what it was like for you during all those months when you were hiding your feelings. Ralph nodded, overwhelmed by the idea of their love story being preserved in words, of having a record of how they had found each other. He said, I'd love to help. They spent the next few weeks working on Samuel's project together, sitting at their kitchen table with notebooks and laptops, reconstructing the timeline of their relationship and exploring the emotions they had felt during each phase. It was both wonderful and painful to revisit those early days of longing and uncertainty, to remember how much they had both been hurting while trying to protect each other. Samuel wrote with honesty and vulnerability about his own confusion and denial, about the way he had convinced himself that his dissatisfaction with dating women was just a matter of not having found the right person yet. He wrote about the moment he had first allowed himself to consider that maybe he was looking for the wrong gender entirely, and how terrifying and liberating that realization had been. Ralph shared his own perspective on those months of silent pining, the way he had learned to find joy in the small moments while grieving for something he thought he could never have. He talked about the careful balance of being supportive while protecting his own heart, about the exhaustion of constantly monitoring his own reactions and responses. Reading Samuel's draft, Ralph was struck by how much pain they had both been carrying, how much energy they had both been spending on hiding and denying and protecting themselves. But he was also amazed by the beauty Samuel had found in their story, the way he had captured not just the struggle, but the chain, not just the fear, but the courage it had taken for both of them to be honest about their feelings. Samuel's professor loved the piece, calling it a moving and authentic exploration of love and identity. But more importantly, the process of writing it had helped both Ralph and Samuel gain new perspective on their journey together. Samuel said, "Writing about it made me realize how brave you were, loving me for so long without any guarantee that I would ever feel the same way." Ralph said, "And reading it made me realize how brave you were, questioning everything you thought you knew about yourself and being willing to risk our friendship for the possibility of something more." They submitted the project and celebrated with dinner at their favorite restaurant, toasting to their love story and to the bright future that stretched out ahead of them. As spring turned into summer, they made plans for the break between semesters. Samuel's family had invited Ralph to spend a week with them at their lake house, and Ralph's parents had extended a similar invitation to Samuel. The idea of being welcomed into each other's families as partners rather than just friends felt like another milestone in their relationship. But first, they had finals to get through. They studied together in their apartment, quizzing each other on psychology concepts and literature themes and biology processes. Ralph loved watching Samuel when he was deep in concentration, the way his brow would furrow slightly and he would unconsciously chew on his pen cap. During a break from studying, Samuel looked up from his textbook and said, "Ralph, can I tell you something?" Ralph said, "Always." Samuel said, "Sometimes I still can't believe this is real, that we're together, that you love me, that I get to wake up next to you every morning. It feels too good to be true." Ralph set aside his own book and moved closer to Samuel on the couch. He said, "I know exactly what you mean, but it is real. We're real, and we're not going anywhere." Samuel leaned into Ralph's embrace. He said, "I used to be so afraid of commitment, of being tied down. But with you, it doesn't feel like being tied down. It feels like being set free." Ralph pressed a kiss to Samuel's temple. He said, "That's because this is what love is supposed to feel like. Not like a cage, but like coming home." They finished their finals with strong grades, both of them having found that their relationship actually helped their academic performance rather than hindering it. Having someone to study with, to celebrate successes with, to comfort during stressful periods had made the challenges of college feel more manageable. The week at Samuel's family lake house was everything Ralph had hoped it would be. Samuel's parents and sister welcomed him warmly, treating him not as Samuel's friend, but as his partner, including him in family jokes and traditions and conversations about the future. Ralph felt like he was getting a glimpse of what his life could look like, surrounded by people who loved and accepted him exactly as he was. Samuel's sister Joan pulled Ralph aside one evening while Samuel was helping his father with the grill. She said, "I've never seen my brother this happy. Thank you for loving him the way he deserves to be loved." Ralph felt tears well up in his eyes. He said, "He makes me happy too. Happier than I ever thought possible." Joan smiled. She said, "I know. It's written all over your face whenever you look at him. You two are good together." Later that night, Ralph and Samuel sat on the dock with their feet in the water, watching the stars reflect on the lake's surface. Samuel said, "My family adores you. My mom told me earlier that she's never seen me as relaxed and genuinely happy as I've been this week." Ralph said, "They're wonderful. I can see where you get your kindness and warmth." Samuel said, "I love that they love you. I love that I don't have to choose between my family and my partner, that you fit into my life so perfectly." Ralph said, "I love that too. I love feeling like I belong." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, holding hands and listening to the gentle lapping of water against the dock. Ralph thought about how much his life had changed since that first morning when Samuel had saved him a seat in class. How a simple gesture had led to this moment, this feeling of complete contentment and belonging. Samuel said, "Ralph, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that there's no pressure and no wrong answer." Ralph turned to look at Samuel, noting the nervous energy in his voice. He said, "Okay." Samuel said, "I've been thinking about the future a lot lately, about what I want my life to look like after college, about the kind of person I want to build that life with. And I keep coming back to you. I keep imagining us together 5 years from now, 10 years from now, building something lasting and beautiful." Ralph's heart started racing. He said, "Samuel," Samuel said, "I'm not asking you to marry me or anything. We're still young, we still have so much growing to do, but I want you to know that when I think about my future, you're in it. You're not just my boyfriend or my partner. You're my person, the person I want to choose every day for the rest of my life." Ralph felt overwhelmed by love and gratitude, and the sheer impossibility of how perfect this moment was. He said, "You're my person too. You've been my person since long before I ever dared to hope you might feel the same way." Samuel said, "So we're in this together, for the long haul." Ralph said, "We're in this together. Whatever comes next, we'll figure it out together." They kissed then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Ralph thought about how love could be both a destination and a journey, both an arrival and a beginning. The rest of the summer passed in a haze of happiness and lazy contentment. They worked part-time jobs to save money for the next school year, spent long afternoons reading in the park, took weekend trips to nearby cities to explore museums and restaurants and bookstores. Every day felt like a gift, an opportunity to learn something new about each other and about themselves. Ralph discovered that Samuel sang in the shower, unconsciously harmonizing with whatever song was stuck in his head. Samuel learned that Ralph talked in his sleep, usually saying things that were sweet and nonsensical and utterly endearing. They collected these small intimacies like treasures, building a catalog of the ways they fit together. One evening in late August, they were packing for their return to campus when Ralph found the notebook where Samuel had written his first drafts of the creative writing project about their relationship. He flipped through the pages, reading Samuel's handwritten thoughts about love and identity and the courage it takes to be honest about who you are. On one page, Samuel had written, "Love is not about finding someone who completes you. It's about finding someone who inspires you to complete yourself. Ralph makes me want to be the best version of myself, not because he demands it, but because his love makes me believe I'm worthy of becoming that person." Ralph felt tears slide down his cheeks as he read. He showed the passage to Samuel, who smiled and wrapped his arms around Ralph from behind. Samuel said, "Do you know what the best part is?" Ralph said, "What?" Samuel said, "That was just the beginning. We have the rest of our lives to keep inspiring each other, to keep growing together, to keep choosing each other every single day." Ralph leaned back against Samuel's chest. He said, "I can't wait to see what the rest of our story looks like." Samuel said, "Whatever it looks like, it's going to be beautiful, because it's ours." As they prepared to start their junior year of college, Ralph reflected on how much had changed since that first day when Samuel had saved him a seat. They were no longer two friends navigating the complicated territory of unspoken feelings. They were partners, committed to building a life together, secure in their love for each other and their shared vision of the future. But some things remained beautifully constant. Samuel still saved Ralph a seat in every class they shared, still smiled that same warm smile when Ralph approached, still made Ralph feel like the most important person in the room. The gesture had evolved from a question to a promise to a celebration, but its essential meaning remained the same. You belong here. You belong with me. You are wanted and welcomed and loved. Their first day back on campus, they walked into their advanced psychology seminar together, and Ralph watched Samuel place his backpack on the chair beside him with the same careful intentionality he had shown months earlier. But now, instead of the nervous energy that had once accompanied the gesture, there was only quiet confidence and joy. When Ralph slid into the saved seat, Samuel reached over and squeezed his hand briefly before turning his attention to the professor. It was a small moment, barely noticeable to anyone else in the room, but it contained everything Ralph needed to know about where he stood in Samuel's life. After class, as they walked across campus toward their apartment, Samuel said, "Do you remember the first time I saved you a seat?" Ralph said, "October 15th, American literature. You had that look on your face like you were trying to solve a puzzle." Samuel laughed. He said, "I was trying to solve a puzzle. I was trying to figure out why sitting next to you felt different from sitting next to anyone else. Why I cared so much about making sure you had a place beside me." Ralph said, "And now you know." Samuel said, "Now I know. It wasn't just about saving you a seat. It was about saving you a place in my life, in my heart, in my future. I just didn't have the words for it yet." Ralph stopped walking and turned to face Samuel. He said, "You know what I love most about that story?" Samuel said, "What?" Ralph said, "That you were choosing me even before you knew you were choosing me. That some part of you recognized what we could be together even when your conscious mind wasn't ready to accept it." Samuel cupped Ralph's face in his hands, right there in the middle of the campus quad, and kissed him deeply. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling. Samuel said, "I'll always save you a seat, Ralph. In every classroom, at every table, is every part of my life. You'll always have a place with me." Ralph said, "And you'll always have a place with me. Always." They continued walking toward their apartment, hands intertwined, and Ralph thought about how sometimes love begins not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with small acts of consideration. A saved seat, a gentle smile, a quiet recognition that this person matters, that they deserve a place beside you, that their presence makes everything better. Samuel had been saving him a seat for months before either of them understood what it meant. But looking back, Ralph could see that it had been a form of love all along. Unconscious, unspoken, but real nonetheless. The kind of love that grows slowly and surely, building a foundation strong enough to support a lifetime of choosing each other. That evening, they sat at their kitchen table working on homework for their respective classes. Ralph was reading about attachment theory for his developmental psychology course, and he came across a passage that made him look up at Samuel with wonder. Ralph said, "Listen to this. Secure attachment is characterized by the belief that you are worthy of love and that others are generally trustworthy and available. It develops when caregivers consistently respond to a child's needs with sensitivity and reliability." Samuel looked up from his own textbook. He said, "That sounds like what we have." Ralph said, "That's exactly what we have. You have taught me that I'm worthy of love, and I've learned to trust that you'll be there when I need you. We've created secure attachment with each other." Samuel reached across the table and took Ralph's hand. He said, "We've healed each other all those years of feeling like I didn't quite fit anywhere, like something was wrong with me for not being able to love the people I was supposed to love. You've shown me that there was never anything wrong with me. I was just looking in the wrong places." Ralph said, "And you've shown me that love doesn't have to be something I earn or deserve. It can just be something that exists between two people who see each other clearly and choose each other freely." Samuel said, "We're pretty amazing, aren't we?" Ralph laughed. He said, "Yeah, we really are." As the semester progressed, Ralph and Samuel settled into the rhythm of being a couple who had moved beyond the initial excitement of new love into something deeper and more sustainable. They had learned each other's habits and preferences, had developed inside jokes and shared references, had created a private world that belonged only to them. Ralph loved the way Samuel made coffee in the morning, humming softly as he measured out grounds and waited for the water to boil. Samuel loved the way Ralph read, completely absorbed in whatever book had captured his attention, unconsciously mouthing words as he processed complex passages. They had learned to navigate each other's moods and needs. When Samuel was stressed about an upcoming exam, Ralph would quietly take over household tasks and create space for studying. When Ralph was feeling anxious about family expectations or future plans, Samuel would listen without trying to fix anything, offering presence and comfort instead of solutions. Their friends had fully accepted them as a couple, including them in group activities and treating their relationship as a natural part of the social landscape. Ralph sometimes marveled at how seamlessly they had transitioned from friends to partners in the eyes of their peer group, how little drama or disruption their relationship had caused. But the most meaningful acceptance came from themselves. Ralph no longer felt like he was living a double life, hiding his true feelings behind a mask of friendship. Samuel no longer felt like he was forcing himself to be someone he wasn't, trying to make relationships work with people who could never truly know him. They had both found peace in their identities as gay men, in their love for each other, in the life they were building together. It felt natural and right and sustainable in a way that neither of them had experienced before. One evening in November, almost exactly a year after Samuel had first started saving Ralph a seat, they were walking home from a study session at the library when Samuel suddenly stopped. Samuel said, "Do you realize what today is?" Ralph thought for a moment, then smiled. He said, "It's been a year since you first saved me a seat in American literature." Samuel said, "A year since I started falling in love with you without realizing it." Ralph said, "A year since you started choosing me before you knew you were choosing me." Samuel pulled Ralph into his arms right there on the sidewalk, under the glow of a streetlight, and kissed him with all the passion and tenderness of someone who had found exactly what they were looking for. When they broke apart, Samuel said, "Happy anniversary of the beginning of us." Ralph said, Happy anniversary of you saving me a seat in your life. Samuel said, best seat I ever saved. Ralph said, best seat I ever took. They walked the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, both of them thinking about how much their lives had changed in just 1 year, how a simple gesture had been the beginning of everything they had ever wanted, how love could grow slowly and quietly before blooming into something magnificent and transformative. At home, they curled up together on their couch with mugs of hot chocolate, and Ralph read aloud from the book he was currently enjoying, while Samuel traced lazy patterns on his arm. It was a perfectly ordinary evening, the kind they had shared hundreds of times, but it felt special because they both understood how precious this ordinary happiness was. Ralph paused in his reading and looked down at Samuel, who was listening with his eyes closed and a contented smile on his face. Ralph said, I love you. Samuel opened his eyes and smiled up at Ralph. He said, I love you too, always and forever. Ralph said, always and forever. They settled back into their comfortable silence, secure in their love for each other, and in the knowledge that they had found something rare and beautiful and worth protecting. Outside, the world continued its busy pace, but inside their small apartment, time seemed to slow down, allowing them to savor this moment of perfect contentment. Samuel had saved Ralph a seat that first morning because something in him had recognized that Ralph belonged beside him. Now, a year later, they both understood that it had never really been about the seat at all. It had been about making space for love to grow, about creating room for two hearts to find each other, about the courage to save a place for someone even when you don't yet understand why they matter so much. Ralph closed his book and settled more comfortably against the couch cushions, Samuel's head resting on his chest, both of them exactly where they belonged. Tomorrow, Samuel would save him another seat in another classroom, and Ralph would slide into it with the same sense of gratitude and wonder he had felt that first morning. Because some gestures never get old, some promises never lose their power, and some love stories are worth repeating every single day. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other on their couch, dreaming of all the seats Samuel would save and all the places Ralph would claim beside him in the years to come. Because they had learned that love is not just about finding someone who completes you, but about finding someone who makes you want to save them a place in every part of your life forever and always.